The storm arrived like an argument, sudden and uninvited. Rain came down in sheets that turned the Mediterranean into a smear of silver, and the yachts in Millionaire harbor bobbed like sleeping beasts. Street lamps blurred into halos, and under their light a small figure ran as if the world were chasing her. She had no umbrella, no shoes, her dress clung to thin knees, and the sea wind tugged loose strands of hair from behind a face older than 7 years should wear. Her name was Leila Marquez. She carried with her a rabbit of fabric, one eye missing, stuffing poking through where life had worn things thin. The toy had the gravity of memory. It was soft. It was a thing to squeeze during thunder. It was the last world she could hold on to when the rest of the world refused to keep her. Up on the hill, a glass house watched the sea. Julian Merritt's estate shone like an island of light, private, immaculate, scripted. He was a man who measured risk and reward in spreadsheets and boardrooms. For him, storms were numbers, damage mitigated, insurance reassured. He had built a life where everything had an owner and everything belonged. When Leila pushed through the rusted gate, shoes sucking in mud, she did something almost nobody expected. She put her small hands on the latch and pushed. She climbed into the manicured garden of a man she'd never met and crouched behind a rose bush, shivering as light and thunder passed over her. The garden smelled like trimmed grass and something else, safety she'd never been offered. Julian Merritt stepped out of his car, the rain beating off the collar of his coat. He had been thinking of a conference call. He had been thinking of acquisition terms. He was not thinking of children. And yet, there she was, a child, soaked and small, who looked up with that curious thing that is the only real test of a person's heart, expectation without entitlement. "Sir, may I sleep in your doghouse tonight?" If you're hearing this 2 minutes in, you are already leaning forward, because the image is insoluble in both worlds, the girl's naked honesty and the man's gilded immensity. The question is not whether he will answer. It is how his answer will rearrange the geometry of everything he calls real. Julian Merritt was not an unkind man, at least not in the ways newspapers measured kindness. He gave carefully, through foundations with long names on glossy brochures. But he had built a life that reduced complexity to leverage, human beings often to data points. His solitude was curated, his friendships efficient. He slept in rooms that looked like corporate headquarters and called his calendar his conscience. When Leila turned and saw Julian, the first thing he did was catch himself, a billionaire surprised into being human. For one breath, he felt the unusual sensation of his plans deferring to a child's reality. He had no dog. He had never had the kind of small interruptions a real life brings, scraped knees, impromptu tea, a tooth to decide, because he had outsourced them, assistants and schedules, people whose job it was to soften edges. The mansion's heavy door opened and light poured like a promise onto wet shoes. He fumbled for a word, something between a greeting and a permission. "You can't stay out here," he said, more to himself than to her. The command had kindness in it, and he startled at how fast his voice had gone gentle. Leila blinked. "I'll be quiet," she promised. She had practiced politeness in places that demanded it, shelters, back alleys, the thin quiet of a bench at dawn. Politeness had been her survival. She had been taught, by hunger, by fear, how to tuck the size of her need into the smallest possible shape. He led her inside. There are moments where houses become more than architecture. They become the agents of choice. Marble floors swallowed the drizzle from her feet. Chandeliers made the air look softer. It was a landscape she had only ever seen through shop windows, and now she was inside it, and the room felt too big and not bigger enough. Julian watched her the way someone watches a rare wildlife film, fascinated, slightly out of his element. He realized, with the kind of electric clarity that often accompanies conscience, that no spreadsheet had ever prepared him for this, a child asking for shelter with the forthrightness of prayer. And in that moment, his life, measured in contracts and features, felt incomplete. He showed her the guest bathroom as if revealing a cathedral. For Leila, the sound of hot water was not background. It was a miracle. She leaned forward and put her face into the vapor, as though inhaling safety itself. He left the door cracked, a small courtesy he hadn't yet named,
and watched the steam fog the glass like a soft world. When she emerged, wrapped in towels that seemed to swallow her frame, she moved like someone discovering a new language. His kitchen offered fruit, things she had only seen in pictorial pages. He made cocoa by hand, simple, warm, not the truffle extravagance his private chef might arrange. He chose small comforts because she needed smaller truths, not spectacle. The first bite of a cookie made her close her eyes. She tasted security in the way a person tastes bread after famine. He watched her as if watching time outgrow itself, and he realized the odd fact that wealth can sometimes make a man spiritually poor. You can buy provision and still go bankrupt in tenderness. That night he pointed at a sofa and said, "You should rest." He meant the guest room, but she imagined a doghouse or a corner, any small shape of safety. She climbed onto the couch as if into a boat. He left the lamp on. The thought of a child not knowing where night would land lodged inside him like a splinter. When he closed the door and the house felt too empty for the first time since it was built, something softened. In the hush, thunder no longer threatened. It narrated. For both of them, the night had become the first paragraph of a story neither had planned to read together.
Dawn is always a revelation when you have prefigured the night as inevitability. Light fell across the marble. Lila woke not to alarm clocks, but to a table set for breakfast. Toast, fruit, the gentle steam of tea. She ate slowly, as if the act of eating could be measured in moments rather than calories. Her hands remembered to save pieces away, a habit of hunger that does not disappear with one meal. Julian sat and watched, while the room filled with small noises, the spoon against ceramic, the soft rasp of cloth. He was the kind of man who had lost the ability to wait for a person to be what they were. Yet there she was, unhurried, unpolished, and simply present. In his chest, a hollow made space for an honest feeling, the possibility that a life could be reordered by gentleness. After breakfast, he asked a practical question that was at heart a moral one. "Why are you out in the rain?" She told him a story that was more absence than narrative. A mother gone, a street that kept swallowing promises, a world that could be loud enough to forget her. He listened without offering pity. Pity, he had learned, compresses. It centers the giver. He wanted to do something different. He did the first hard thing. He asked her if she would like clean clothes. She chose a plain dress in the shop window, the cheapest one she could find to be polite. He didn't bargain. He bought the dress, not the rumor of a good deed, and watched the moment when a child realized that some people will give without a return. It changed him more than it changed her. It was the silent accounting of altered priorities. They left the boutique through an afternoon that smelled of warm stone and gasoline. Lila's feet were lighter. She considered her reflection like a visitor would examine a painting. But in the crowd, 3 men lingered at the curb with the casual cruelty of those who traffic in fear. Their eyes were the kind that classify people into debts. Lila's face drained of color as she recognized them. The men had a business of using desperation to make profit. A look, a shove, a threat, small violences that accumulate into a life of shadows. They had seen Lila before, and now they understood her new vulnerability, a child who had found a shelter that was not street. Julian, untrained in street fights but trained in risk, moved. He placed himself between the men and the small girl, and used his voice the way men sometimes must use what they have, as a shield. He told them to leave. He gave them cash, he tried to buy time, he tried to buy distance. Their snarls promised repetition. That night, he realized there were things money could not prevent. Memory, cruelty, the way neighborhoods keep their economies of neglect. The threats were not only physical, they were proof that when a child steps into another world, her past can follow like a storm. He tightened the estate's security and called a friend to arrange help. But he also woke that night with a different question. What responsibility does one human owe to another when they have the capacity to alter the arc of that life? He found the answer rising in him as a stubbornness to do more than temporary shelter.
Clara Romano arrived with the letters and the practiced compassion of someone who has negotiated bureaucracy and belief. She smelled faintly of tea and paper. She was the sort of woman who would learn to keep surprises folded in compassion. When she met Lila, she asked for a name and then for a story. How long on the streets? Did she have family? Where could records be found? Lila's answers were partial, embroidered with gap and loss. Clara's job is seldom to fix everything on the first day. It is to begin an honest map. She listened to Lila as if she were reconnecting something that had been unclipped. She told Julian gently that the state would prefer formal processes, guardianship, assessments, a slow legal kindness. Julian bristled at procedure. He had built a company that could move continents. Why did a child require forms and signatures? Yet Clara's presence reminded him of a complicated truth. When you extend shelter, you must also extend accountability. For Lila's sake, the rescue could not be solitary. It needed the steadiness of law and community. Clara warned of people who would exploit their goodwill, of wolves in fine suits and raw coats. The conversation landed with gravity. Julian realized that love can be reckless. Love without structure can be dangerous in its own way. He promised to do what needed doing. In the silence of the room, Lila, curled in an oversized shirt, watched the future fold itself into presence.
Routine is a thin armor when the world still has sharp edges. A week into their quiet domestic arrangement, a bath, a new dress, school registration papers in process, Lila accompanied Clara to a medical checkup. The world hummed with the ordinary busyness that masks the extraordinary, and trust takes small steps through ordinary acts. The clinic's door swung closed behind them, and Julian returned to a meeting he could not postpone. He was running through strategies when Clara's voice halved his day. They took her. You can feel how the scene compresses. A man who has measured life in contracts suddenly thrown into bargaining with terror. He arrived at the clinic to find the space as calm as any public place, but the security footage told the story of a van sliding into shadow, of hands ushering a small figure in without resistance, and of the silence that followed. The men who'd followed earlier had returned, this time to steal what hope had found. The call demanded ransom. The men wanted money. But more than money, they wanted power, the kind that turns a child into currency. Julian listened, his hands absent of all his old certainties. He could call police, he could call every contact, he could hire investigators and raise alarms, but he knew in the rawness of that hour that a child's life is not a business negotiation. It is fragile and finite. He agreed to meet them, alone, with the money they demanded. The scene at the docks, crates and gulls and a sky tasting of oil and regret, would become the decisive image in his life. A man trading currency for a human life, and in the process, trading a kind of freedom for the bond that would outlast any ledger. The dock was a place where echoes multiply, boats calling like tired animals, waves against rusting hulls, voices carried and lost. Under a single bulb, Julian stepped into a world of threats and tricks. He held a duffel of money in a sweat that smelled like fear. The men emerged like shadows that had learned the shape of cruelty. Inside, Lila sat tied to a chair. She looked small against industrial cold, but in her eyes was the kind of clarity that has been taught by necessity. Watch, listen, remember. She had learned the names of men, the routes they took, the schools their children attended, an inventory a desperate mind constructs as talisman. The room felt unreal. The bearded man's voice like a blade, the shipment of cash placed like an offering. Julian's money could buy their silence, perhaps, but Lila, with a steadiness that made the hair on his neck prick, began to speak. She named names, she named addresses, she recited small facts the criminals had forgotten she'd heard. Her words landed with the force of exposure. The men staggered between fury and fear. They fled into the night, and in their panic they left a space that the police would soon fill. Later, when he carried her to the car, he felt something that had nothing to do with victory. He felt hollowed and whole at the same time. He had paid a price no ledger could measure. He had traded his privacy and his calm for the life of a child. And the truth that lodged into his chest was simple and bright. He no longer wanted to be a spectator of life. He wanted to be present in it. The adoption process is a kind of legal prayer.
forms that ask you to commit to love in the language of domiciles and references. There were hearings in Paris, signatures, fingerprints, reporters who half expected spectacle. Leela listened to voices that sounded important and abstract while she held on to the rabbit tucked into her sweater. When the judge asked a small question of the child, "Where do you want to live?" she answered with the most ordinary, revolutionary thing, "With my dad." The single word landed like prayer. For Julian, tears broke a barrier that no algorithm had ever breached. He felt the weight and joy of a new role, not investor, not patron, but father. They made a decision that day that would ripple beyond the rooms of obscure legalities. Julian and Leela returned to the mansion, and the house changed. Drawings taped to refrigerators, mismatched mugs, a soccer ball in the conservatory, small rebellions against the sterile perfection the estate had once enforced. The world outside still talked in markets and forecasts, but inside, life made a new grammar. They opened a shelter in Naples and another in Marseille. Julian converted rooms into classrooms, but the most radical thing he did was not the money, it was staying. He realized the deepest thing charity has to be, patient presence, and that is something spreadsheets cannot predict.
Around the small white doghouse that Lila had once dared to name as her wish, flowers grew in spirals. She planted them herself. Marigolds, resilient and loud, lavender, small and steady. On a tiny wooden plaque they wrote the words, "For every child who needs shelter tonight." Julian knelt and dug in the soil beside her. He was learning the slow, dumb gift of hands in dirt, humility. At night, the mansion no longer echoed with only contracts. It hummed with homework, with Lila's laugh, with the sound of a man learning to ask instead of demand. He had started a foundation in Lila's name. He hired social workers and educators. He spoke fewer in boardrooms and more in classrooms. It would not be easy. The world is stubborn with old patterns. There would be threats and resentments and the odd headline accusing him of a PR stunt. But for the first time in a long time, he had a story he could live in. And somewhere out at sea, the storm passed. Morning always does. Lila's rabbit sat on the windowsill catching light. Julian learned, slowly and with the stubbornness of the human heart, that wealth was a tool, not a life. He had found an answer to a small question whispered in a storm. "May I sleep in your doghouse tonight?" It turned out to be not a plea, but an invitation to change. When the world learned what had happened in that mansion on the hill, when headlines began to whisper about a billionaire who had taken in a homeless child, Julian Merritt's name transformed overnight. For some, he was a hero. For others, he was a hypocrite with good lighting. The news spun 1,000 versions of the same truth. He's using the girl for publicity. He's trying to clean his conscience. He's finally found his soul. Julian read none of it, but he could feel it, that tightening of the air around him when people start defining your motives before you do. Lila was oblivious, of course. She only knew that her dad, yes, she had begun calling him that, woke earlier, smiled more, and walked her to school each morning. She didn't know that every camera lens was now searching for them. The first few months after the adoption were a test of endurance. Julian's board members grew uneasy. His assistant whispered about optics. Investors wanted to know if his newfound philanthropy meant distraction. And while they calculated risk, Julian was busy with something unquantifiable, learning how to braid hair, how to explain algebra, how to apologize to a child when you raise your voice by accident. The foundation, Lila's Haven, launched quietly from one of his unused offices in Geneva. Its mission was simple: shelter for children who had none. No grand opening, no gala, just beds, warmth, food, and names remembered. At the first shelter, Lila helped paint the sign. The letters were uneven, the paint dripping, but she grinned like she'd painted the sky itself. When a journalist asked Julian how it felt to use his fortune for good, he paused longer than most billionaires are trained to do. "I'm not using my fortune. I'm using my life." That night, sitting in the garden where a storm had once brought a child to his door, he watched her chase fireflies barefoot across the grass. And it struck him that what had begun as a rescue was no longer one. It was a home being built from both directions. Sometimes, goodness feels heavier than sin because it demands we carry it every day, quietly, without applause. It began with a photograph. Someone caught an image of Lila and Julian outside a shelter. His hand on her shoulder, her face lifted in laughter. The picture went viral overnight. By dawn, it was everywhere. The billionaire and the orphan. Talk shows debated whether it was sincere. Social media dissected every smile. Commentaries called it emotional branding. Others saw it as a miracle of compassion. Lila didn't understand why strangers had opinions about her breakfast, her dress, her father's motives. One afternoon after school, she asked him the question that breaks the heart of any parent who's ever tried to shield a child from the world. "Dad, why do they hate kind people?" Julian set down his coffee and stared into the golden light filtering through the kitchen window. He said softly, "They don't hate kindness, sweetheart. They just don't always understand it. Sometimes people attack what they secretly wish they had the courage to do." He didn't tell her that his lawyers had advised him to keep her out of public view. He didn't tell her that his company's stock had fallen 3% because investors distrusted anything unpredictable, especially love. Instead, he focused on the one thing that mattered, keeping her sense of wonder intact. So he took her out of the headlines and into the world. They visited small towns where nobody recognized them. They walked through open markets, shared meals with strangers, and volunteered in local kitchens. There, away from flashbulbs, they learned something about visibility, that it's not how many people see you, but what they see in you that counts. At one shelter, a boy who had lost everything asked Lila if rich people ever felt lonely. She thought for a long time before answering. Maybe, but not when they're with people like us. Julian's heart cracked open just a little wider at that. That night, in his journal, he wrote a single line. "If love is genuine, it survives misunderstanding." And in that sentence lay the secret of every enduring act of compassion, that true goodness is not about what the world says you are doing, but who you become while doing it.
Success had trained Julian to control outcomes, but fatherhood, real, messy, human fatherhood, was chaos disguised as grace. He found himself learning awkwardly from therapists, teachers, and child advocates who knew more about healing than he ever would. Dr. Helena Moore, a child trauma expert, told him once during an interview, "Mr. Merritt, what you're doing isn't charity, it's repair, and repair is harder than generosity." That line followed him for weeks. He began attending workshops, sitting quietly in back rows, taking notes on childhood attachment and trust. He listened to caseworkers describe the slow, invisible labor of rebuilding safety in children who had been broken by neglect. Lila noticed the change. He wasn't the man of marble anymore. He was human, imperfect, late sometimes, distracted, apologizing with genuine eyes. At night, he would tuck her in and ask, "What made you smile today?" She would tell him about school, about new friends, about a teacher who smelled like coffee, about the class pet rabbit that reminded her of the one she'd once carried through the storm. Each story was a fragment of healing, not just hers, but his. He started understanding that wealth cannot shortcut growth. It can only fund the soil. What matters is showing up, again and again and again. And when the foundation staff began to complain of burnout, Julian didn't send a memo. He invited them for dinner. One long wooden table, home-cooked vegan meals, laughter echoing under candlelight. He told them, "If you want to save children, you have to first remember your own humanity." That night, the foundation quietly became a movement, not of money, of presence. Marissa Merritt had always been the voice of reason in the Merritt family, pragmatic, political, brilliant, and unsparing. She had built her own empire not with glass towers, but with debates and votes. When she first read about her brother's sudden transformation, she called it sentimental recklessness. She arrived at his mansion with the force of a headline. "Julian, you're risking everything. The board is nervous. Investors are talking. You can't save every stray you find." He listened. He didn't argue. He simply motioned for her to follow him outside. They walked through the garden where Lila was watering a row of wildflowers.
"Marissa," he said quietly, "do you remember what Mom used to tell us when we fought?" She frowned. "That we should share?" "No. She said, don't close the door on someone who knocks softly." He nodded toward Lila. "She knocked softly, Marissa. I just opened the door." For the first time, his sister had no retort. She looked at the little girl, the one who had asked to sleep in a doghouse, and saw not a scandal, but a small miracle that had made her brother human again. Weeks later, she returned to Parliament and introduced a bill offering tax incentives for private shelters and educational grants for at-risk youth. The legislation passed, quietly, without fanfare, but it would go on to save thousands. When reporters asked why she had sponsored it, she said only, "Because my brother taught me that empathy is contagious." That night, Julian found her email in his inbox. 3 words: "You were right." He smiled. Sometimes redemption doesn't look like tears. Sometimes it looks like family finally speaking the same language: kindness. The past doesn't knock politely. It breaks in through memory, through shadows, through the sound of thunder that reminds you of a night you thought you wouldn't survive. Months after her rescue, Lila began waking up again in the middle of the night. Her small hands clenched the bedsheets, her eyes darting towards corners that were empty. The nightmares had returned: the men, the van, the storm. Julian would rush to her room, sitting beside her until she calmed. He didn't say, "You're safe," because safety isn't a word, it's a presence. He would simply stay, silent, steady, his hand resting lightly on her back until the trembling stopped. Some nights when she couldn't sleep, she'd whisper, "I still see them." And he would answer, "Then let me stand between you and the dream." He knew what fear does, how it reshapes the world, how it carves invisible scars. But he also knew something else, that consistency, not comfort, heals a child's trust. At school, Lila struggled. She was kind, but withdrawn. Teachers noticed how she flinched at sudden noises, how she saved pieces of lunch in napkins, just in case. Julian met with the school counselor, his jaw tight as he listened to terms like trauma bonding, post-stress response, attachment formation. All he could think was, she's 7, and already had to survive what most adults couldn't maim. He couldn't erase the past, but he could build enough light around her so that the darkness lost its grip. So he began changing his world for hers. He cut back his meetings. He turned one of the mansion's unused rooms into a library filled with beanbags and storybooks. He replaced the staff rotation so that familiar faces stayed. And one evening when she brought him a drawing, a crooked little house under a smiling sun with 2 stick figures holding hands, he realized the meaning of faith. Not religion, not creed. Faith as the belief that broken things can love again.
It began small, a reading program at one of Lila's Haven shelters, then art classes, then mentorship for orphans aging out of the system. But what began as charity slowly became revolution. Julian didn't fund projects. He listened to stories. He met children who had survived wars, hunger, betrayal. He learned from social workers, from teachers, from street volunteers. In Naples, he met a woman named Angela Russo, a former nun who had dedicated her life to rescuing trafficked children. She told him something that stayed with him forever. You can't fix suffering with pity. Pity looks down. Love kneels. That line changed the way he led everything. He stopped being Mr. Marrett, philanthropist. He became Julian, the man who shows up. He swept floors at shelters, taught English lessons, even served food with his sleeves rolled up. And for the first time, his employees followed not out of obligation, but inspiration. They started volunteering, too. His company began offering paid community hours, and productivity, ironically, soared.
because something had shifted in the air. People began believing that goodness wasn't weakness. At home, Lila's grades improved. She laughed more. She started bringing home friends. The mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth. It was a gathering place for change. But every miracle attracts its test. One morning, the foundation received an anonymous complaint accusing Julian of exploiting children for image. It spread quickly, through news feeds, blogs, talk shows. Once again, his name was dragged through public suspicion. And this time, it wasn't only him who felt it. It was Lila. She overheard classmates whisper, "She's the charity kid." That evening, she came home and said, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm your charity." Julian knelt beside her. "No," he said softly, his voice trembling, "you're my reason." Outside, rain began to fall again, the first storm since the night she'd arrived. And inside, for the second time, he made the same choice, to open the door not to a stranger, but to truth. When the media turns on you, it doesn't need facts, it needs appetite. Pundits dissected his every action. They said the foundation was a smokescreen. They accused him of emotional manipulation. He could have fought back, with press conferences, lawyers, money, but instead he stayed silent because he'd learned something the world hadn't, that goodness doesn't need to argue to exist. But silence has its cost. Donations slowed, partnerships wavered, shelters faced closure. Then one afternoon, a journalist named Daniela Cruz, who had once criticized him, requested an interview. "I have seen your numbers. You could be faking this. But every person I spoke to, they cried when they talked about what your shelters did for them. What's your secret?" Julian smiled faintly. "There isn't one. We just listen longer than the world expects." That interview changed everything. The segment went viral. The billionaire who chose silence over self-defense. People began to see him differently, but the real victory wasn't his. It was Lila's. When her teacher asked the class to write about heroes, she didn't write about her father. She wrote about Clara Novelli, the social worker who had refused to give up. "She taught me that being kind isn't enough. You have to stay kind even when people don't understand you," the essay read. He read it later that night, and for the first time he understood what his role truly was, not savior, not protector, but witness to a young girl's growth. Life rarely offers cinematic closure, but sometimes it offers grace in small, trembling doses. 3 years after the storm, Julian and Lila returned to Naples. The air was thick with salt and memory. Together they visited the first shelter ever built in her name. As they entered, a group of children ran to her, not because she was famous, but because she understood. She knelt, meeting their eyes at level, laughing as they tugged at her sleeves. And then, unexpectedly, a woman stepped forward. Older now, weary-eyed, carrying a cane. It was one of the former women from the gang that had trafficked children, now reformed, now volunteering at the shelter. She held a small photograph of Lila years ago in the alley where she'd first been found. "I was there that night. I didn't help you. I should have." Lila looked at her, quiet, steady. "You're helping now." That was the moment forgiveness became visible. Julian watched as the two embraced, a circle completed, not in vengeance, but in understanding. That night, walking by the harbor, he asked, "Do you ever wish that night never happened?" She thought for a long moment, gazing at the lights on the water. "If it hadn't," she said softly, "I wouldn't have found you." He took her hand. The air was cool, the waves gentle, and in that silence, both of them knew storms don't always destroy. Sometimes they deliver.
The years passed like tide water, not loud, but persistent. Lila grew taller, surer. Her laughter filled the mansion's marble halls that once echoed with loneliness. Julian aged softly, his once stern face mellowed by peace. She learned languages, studied social work, volunteered at shelters bearing her name, Lila's Haven, the seed of one rainy night, now a network of light stretching across continents. And though the world moved on to other headlines, those who visited the shelters whispered her story like a prayer. There was once a girl who asked to sleep in a doghouse, and a man who gave her the world instead. Julian rarely spoke of the past, but sometimes when the rain fell heavy on the glass windows, he'd find himself standing by the garden, remembering that night, the trembling voice, the soaked toy rabbit, the way compassion had entered his life disguised as a plea for shelter. He would smile to himself, the way men do when they realize life had been saving them all along. 10 years to the day since the night she first arrived, the sky darkened again over the coast. It wasn't a violent storm, but one of memory, the kind that hums softly, reminding you how far you've come. Lila was now 17. She had just finished a speech at the opening of another shelter, her voice steady before hundreds. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone who had seen both cruelty and mercy and learned to believe in the latter. That evening, she came home to find Julian waiting with 2 mugs of tea. "Do you remember this?" he asked, handing her a worn toy rabbit, carefully restored. Her eyes widened. "You kept it." "Always," he said. "It reminded me of courage. Not mine, but yours." They sat in silence for a while, the storm pattering gently on the windows. Then she said something that caught him off guard. "You didn't just save me, Dad. You taught me what saving someone really means. It's not about pulling them out of the water. It's about teaching them to swim when you're gone." He nodded, his eyes glistening. Outside, the wind rose again, but this time it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like freedom. Time is generous to the heart, but unkind to the body. Julian's health began to falter, quietly at first. Fatigue, a slower step, a hand that shook slightly when he lifted his tea. He tried to hide it, but Lila noticed. "Dad," she said gently one morning, "you don't have to be strong all the time." He smiled. "That's the only way I know how to love." But age, like the tide, cannot be reasoned with. When he finally collapsed in his study one winter evening, the foundation staff rushed him to the hospital. Lila sat by his bedside for days, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. When he woke, his voice was faint, but his humor remained. "You look just like the nurse I asked for," he whispered, smiling weakly. Lila laughed through tears. "You never stop making jokes, do you?" He shook his head. "If I do, it means I'm gone." But beneath the laughter, there was understanding. The seasons of their lives had shifted. She was now the guardian. He was now the one being kept safe. And yet, in that reversal, there was beauty, because love had completed its circle. Julian passed away quietly one spring morning. The same sunlight that had once spilled across marble floors now fell gently on a framed photograph by his bedside. Of him and Lila, 10 years earlier, covered in paint from a shelter they'd built together. He left behind no fortune. He had given most of it away. But he left a letter, sealed with his initials. Lila opened it with trembling hands. "My dearest Lila, I once thought I rescued you from a storm,
but I see now you were the one who led me out of mine. I spent half my life building walls and the other half trying to remember why I built them. You tore them down with 7 words. Sir, may I sleep in your doghouse? If people ask what my legacy is, tell them it was never the shelters, or the speeches, or the wealth. It was this simple truth, that kindness is the only currency that appreciates when you spend it. Love boldly, forgive quickly, and keep the door open, always. Dad. Lila held the letter to her chest and wept, not from loss, but from gratitude so deep it hurt. Outside, the wind stirred the roses in the garden, scattering petals across the grass. The storm had long passed, but its lessons remained.
After the funeral, reporters asked Lila if she planned to take over her father's foundation. She smiled faintly. "I'm not taking it over. I'm continuing what was never finished." Under her leadership, Lila's haven evolved. No longer just a network of shelters, it became a movement for ethical wealth, teaching business leaders how to integrate empathy into commerce. She spoke at universities, urging future entrepreneurs to measure success not by profit margins, but by how many lives they uplifted. Her father's motto, "Kindness scales faster than capital," became etched into the foundation's mission. And though she stood on global stages, she never forgot the simplicity of where it began. Every anniversary of that storm, she would visit the old mansion, now transformed into the Merit home for children. She'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset over the harbor, whispering to the wind, "We're still opening doors, Dad." 10 years later, Lila was invited to speak at the United Nations. Her address wasn't about policy or numbers, it was about faith, not in religion, but in each other. She said, "When I was 7, I asked a stranger if I could sleep in his doghouse. He could have turned away, but he didn't. He opened a door. And through that door walked every child who would ever need shelter again. My father's act didn't restore faith in humanity, it reminded humanity that faith was never gone, only forgotten." The audience rose in silence, not clapping, but standing, the way people do in the presence of something sacred. That night, her speech circled the globe, but in the quiet of her hotel room, she didn't watch the headlines, she reread her father's letter. And beneath his signature, she added her own words. "Love, like light, travels farther in darkness." Years later, when she was old and gray, visitors to Lila's haven often found her sitting in the garden with children, telling them stories. Not of money or fame, but of a night when a billionaire chose humanity over fear. She would point to the small wooden doghouse, freshly painted each year, surrounded by flowers. "This," she'd say, "is where everything began, and it's where everything continues." One child once asked her, "Do you still miss him?" She smiled. "No, because I see him in every open door, in every warm bed, in every laugh that wasn't supposed to survive." The camera slowly pans upward to the garden, to the sea, to the sky turning gold. The narrator's voice returns, quiet, reverent. They say faith in humanity is lost, but maybe it isn't lost, just waiting for someone brave enough to answer a small voice in the rain. And when we do, when we open the door instead of turning away, the world changes not with thunder, but with the gentle sound of kindness becoming real. The music swells, piano, cello, soft strings. A quote fades on screen. "To love is not to rescue, but to recognize. To give is not to lose, but to begin again."
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and leave a kind comment. To help the channel stay motivated to create more great videos, please hit the subscribe button. wishing you happiness and peace in the light and love of God.